optics, but to in fact just tell the ISRO chairman, and you can see these visuals on your screen right now, in fact hugging Mr. Sivan there, quite emotional. The ISRO chairperson, it seems at this moment, this has taken a lot of effort from the scientists, and these would be very reassuring visuals for the scientist community. In fact, it seems both Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, and the chairperson of ISRO, extremely emotional at this moment. The entire country would in fact understand, feel the pain that Mr. Sivan would be going on. It was a very tough night for him. I just want to stay with these visuals that the Prime Minister is leaving the ISRO headquarters there. The chairperson has come out to see him off. But just at that moment, that emotional, in fact, hug, the ISRO chairperson, who would have been very, very anxious through the night, throughout this mission. Shiv, if I can draw you in, these are defining visuals, isn't it? The Prime Minister assuring the ISRO chairperson, the entire scientific community, the country stands with you. It was heartbreaking to see the chairperson almost breaking down there, but many lessons learned.
You know, the body language of the Prime Minister there is almost like that of an older brother. Very, you know, warm, affectionate, older brotherly sort of body language by the Prime Minister there, patting, you know, Mr. Sivan and other senior scientists on the back, you know, being, you know, very affectionate and understanding. And, you know, and I think this may be the kind of speech that this scientist team really needed to hear today. I'm not for a moment suggesting, Ankit, that you know, the ISRO team needs a moral boost or a moral support at this point of time. They have seen you know, setbacks in the past and overcome them with amazing efficiency and amazing success, and that's the reason why they're respected all over the world. But what the Prime Minister has done today by spending you know, the last 25 minutes actually making this speech to all those scientists who've toiled overnight dealing with the fallout and dealing with the implications of that little setback right at the end of the Chandrayaan 2 mission, means the Prime Minister was also giving them something to look forward to, a vision really as far as the government leadership is concerned, and the belief, because he spoke on behalf of the country, a belief in you know, in the space program and what ISRO actually stands for. I think one other very important thing, Ankit, is the Prime Minister appeared to have also acknowledged that there was a great deal of pressure on ISRO over the last few weeks because of social media, because of the national media, because of the huge amount of attention that was paid to this particular mission, and that may have added some pressure. And therefore the Prime Minister, by putting out a hand, tapping them on the back, making this speech and telling them that the country feels nothing but pride for them, was to say, look, what has happened, but it doesn't for a moment represent what you are worth, because the best is yet to come. I don't think something better than that could have been said at this stage.
Absolutely. Raj Chengappa, Group Editorial Director, India Today, back with us. You know, Raj, these are possibly the most telling images, the most important images of the day. Yes, there was, you know, ISRO is a professional organization. They have always learned from, you know, whatever setback that they have faced. But for somebody who was leading this team, the entire country, in fact, was watching this. There was so much pressure on Dr. Sivan, the chairperson of ISRO, and of course after a very long night keeping it all together, he did get a little emotional there, and the Prime Minister's reassurance will do a you know, great deal of good for the scientific community across the country.
Yes, I agree, Ankit. It was tremendous that the Prime Minister spoke. He lifted their spirits. It was a very important time to say that India is with you. And Ankit, I recall, you know, when I was speaking to Dr. Kalam when he was alive, he had mentioned a very interesting episode that happened. He was, if you recall, in charge of India's first satellite launch vehicle, which put, you know, for the first time made India into a space power. Now, on the first attempt, SLV-3 tumbled into the Bay of Bengal. And at that time, Satish Dhawan was the chairman, and he walked up to Kalam and said, "Carry on." And Brahm Prakash, who was the director, Kalam's director, tore up his resignation. Kalam wanted to resign at that time. And then Kalam said the biggest lesson he learned was that because of that failure, it was a tremendous stepping stone to success. He learned more from failure than success. He said, if that first one had succeeded, we would not have done the kind of thorough reviews that had happened subsequently. So in some senses, setbacks are part of the space program. But I'm not saying that this is a failure as yet, because we still have to get confirmation of what really happened. But the Prime Minister's words were very important. He said, we came close, we need to cover more ground. So while we look at the achievements that Chandrayaan 2 has done, and they are enormous, one, of course, is the fact that we have validated Isro's giant rocket, the GSLV Mark III, which we've got nicknamed Bahubali. It is the biggest rocket we have built. It lifted 4 tons. First time we tested it on Chandrayaan, took a big risk. The risk paid off. It launched Chandrayaan across. Then we had the orbiter. Now the orbiter has been functioning normally. Now actually the orbiter is almost 60 to 70% of the mission, because the orbiter has 8 very critical instruments that are there that will for the next 2 years send data about the moon, particularly about water possibility in the moon, which is its main mission that is there. And those parameters so far, from what we know, are functioning normally. So you've got a large thing. The other part of it, which was the lander and the rover, that is what is now in doubt. But I was talking, I was there last night, and when we saw the so far, for almost 10 minutes or so, the launch seemed perfect. Every single, there was a tracker line, and there was a trajectory path which Isro had done, and it showed that it was following that path. It is the last-minute deviation, and from what I can understand, Ankit, there are 3 phases that were very critical to this launch. And if you look, what it had to do was the lander was at 30 kilometers. They had to kill the velocity and bring it down to 0, because it was traveling at 6,000 kilometers per hour, orbiting the lunar surface at every 2 hours. So they had to first bring it down to somewhat ground level, but while doing that, they had to kill the velocity and make it 0. Now, there were 3 phases that were very critical to that particular issue. It is called, the first phase is called the rough braking phase. Remember, and I'm just showing my pen if you can see it, the lander, if this is the lander, it's going in this direction. What happens is it has 4 engines here that will start firing to ensure that it actually reverses this thing. So it's almost like a braking engine, and once it starts losing the speed, it begins to go down in terms of heading to, there's a descent phase, what we call the descent phase. Now clearly the rough braking phase seemed to have worked, because according to the calculations, that was to do fire for 10 minutes and 20 seconds, and bring the spacecraft down to 7.5 kilometers, the lander down to 7.5 kilometers. That was achieved. Then you had what is called the absolute navigation phase, which is a 40-second firing, and that is to bring it down further to about 5 to 6 kilometers, or even lower, possibly to 2 to 3 kilometers that was being planned. But this is where the problem begins to occur, because the fine braking phase was announced.
Right.
And we all heard that. Now, the Isro team says they lost contact by 2 kilometers, but if you saw the screen at that time, it was showing an altitude of 330 meters, which means that it was able to track it till that particular point. Now, there is a critical maneuver at that point, because as I was telling you, if you see the pen here, the lander was going like this. Okay, what it had to do is to correct itself and be hovering above the surface so that it can do a landing on its pads. Now, so that is a very slow tilt. At that particular point, one understands it was still at a tilt. Now, when that, we have 4 engines that are supposed to be correcting the tilt now, and then also straightening it out for the landing. Something must have happened during that particular phase, because after that it seems to have lost control, or communication was lost. So from what I can understand and glean from that problem was, it was at this critical stage where the 4 engines were to shut down. Now, one of the big things that you need to know from what I'm gathering is that this is the first time we are testing those 4 engines. Now, we have used these engines in the past, but what we had done for this particular mission was what is called a throttable engine, which means it's like you can taper the energy coming in and out.
Okay.
That was necessary to decelerate the lander so that it could reach the point of landing.
Right.
From what it seems like that had, while they were firing properly during the orbiting phase, when the switchover was going to happen and to make it vertical, there was a problem. We don't know beyond that, but it seems that where that critical phase of where it had to stand vertical, and the 4 engines. One of the problems that could have occurred is these 4 engines all have to fire at the same time or shut down at the same time. Now, if one of them don't do it, you will develop a spin and the lander will start moving downwards. Now, in an uncontrollable fashion, and you could lose control of it. So we don't know what really happened, but these are some of the areas which are critical. And if you recall, Dr. Sivan said, the chairman of Isro said, these are 15 minutes of terror. Actually, it performed close to 13 minutes, and in the last 2 minutes, we began to see problems, what they call the fine breaking phase.
Okay.
And those, the nightmare that he imagined in some senses was coming real. But of course, it is still not confirmed what really happened to the craft, whether it is still had landed safely on the ground, whether all the things are there. It's now been close to 8-9 hours since that incident.
And Raj, to draw any conjecture at this point of time will be premature, because we will have to wait for a thorough analysis of the data which has come in, and only then, of course, any conclusion can be reached on exactly what happened, what went wrong, what were the objectives which were not achieved. Raj, I request you to stay on with me. We are also being joined by Dr. Sudeep Bhattacharya. He is Associate Professor, Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. Gauhar Raza, former Chief Scientist, the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, also with us on the broadcast. Shivarur continues to be with us. I very quickly just want to go across to Dr. Sudeep Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya, in no other way can this be described but the fact that with whatever resources, and people are still, in fact, all over the globe, still are absolutely baffled by the fact that in such a tight budget, India was able to achieve, in fact, the Chandrayaan 2 and the kind of success that we have. This still remains one of the most stellar performances by Isro.
Yes, definitely. So it is not a failure, I would say. The orbiter is still rounding the moon, and there are 8 scientific instruments on orbiter, and among these 8 instruments, there are 2 instruments which will still search for water on moon, and then there are 2 cameras which will map the lunar surface, and then there is 1 spectrometer which will search for the chemical composition, and there are other 3 instruments which will also work. So I would say this is not a failure at all. There is a technological failure at the end, possibly, we do not know yet, but from the scientific point of view, among the total 13 instruments, the 5 instruments were in the rover and the lander, and 8 instruments are on orbiter. Moreover, if I understand correctly, the orbit of the orbiter is a polar orbit.
Yes.
So it will cover the pole as well as the equator, unlike an equatorial orbit. And as the moon will spin around its own axis within this orbit of the orbiter, in a month or so, orbital will map the entire surface of the moon. So within 1 year of nominal lifetime of the orbital, the orbital will map the surface of the moon several times. So scientifically, we are not lost, or it's not a failure.
Right. Just stay on with me, sir. In fact, let me bring in Shivarur as well on this. Nolan also joining us this morning. Dr. Gauhar Raza continues to be with us. Shiv, I just once again want to bring the attention back on this very moment of the Prime Minister and Dr. Sivan. It is also, as you were saying, a Prime Minister coming out very, just as a big brother, more, that was the vibe when he spoke to the scientists there at Isro as well. The fact remains that for Dr. Sivan, who will himself will have to go back, not only analyze the data, but also have to, boost the morale of his team as well. because they have been at it for many, many months, even years, day in, day out.
Ankit, at the end of the day, it's going to be ISRO chairman, Mr. Sivan's job to actually hold his flock together and make sure that they do not waste even a moment feeling bad about what happened, and they stay on course to fulfill their duties in first figuring out what went wrong and then moving on to the next. This is going to be an easy task for him because this is a highly professional organization with some of the best scientists in the world. But if you looked at the body language, you saw what happened last night over midnight, when this setback actually was taking place. You saw Mr. Sivan looking very tense. Then he got up, he went and spoke to the Prime Minister, and then the Prime Minister, spoke to him, and then he immediately left from that room and he was escorted downstairs, and then he addressed the scientists a little later. So it seemed like the Prime Minister wanted to give the ISRO chairman his space to be with his people at a time, which was difficult. They needed to digest what had happened, and therefore it looked like the Prime Minister was giving him a little space, get them to speak among themselves, see what needs to be done, all the scientific stuff, and then the Prime Minister came back in to address them very briefly before leaving. And it was only this morning that the Prime Minister had a much larger message, for not just the scientists at ISRO, but the scientific community in general. I think the scientists would have found it highly invaluable. They would be touched by the gesture. The Prime Minister, made it a point to be there yesterday, showing his own belief in what happened. And the fact that there was a setback also shows that, the country, the Prime Minister, the system was willing to, take that risk, to be there, to be with the ISRO and be with the scientists as they reached in the dark. So I think the big takeaway from this is definitely going to be that the Chandrayaan 2 mission is far from over. No part of it was actually a failure. We have to take the setback seriously to learn from it, and the Prime Minister has provided a very valuable vision as far as scientific temper is concerned.